Do you enjoy fair, comboless gameplay? Maybe you miss Deathrite Shaman. Or do you simply want to turn your opponent's cards into elks? Welcome to Vintage Vanguard, a new video series where I introduce you to the 11 most played decks in Vintage, starting with today, Bug Midrange. Welcome, Vintage Gamers, to the first episode of Vintage Vanguard. Today, I'm going to introduce you to Bug Midrange. In a sea of powerful combo decks, Bug continues to be a viable option for pilots looking to play fair Magic the Gathering. In this episode, I'm going to introduce you to the ins and outs of the deck, how it plays versus opposition, and finish off the video with some gameplay footage. While other decks in Vintage aim to put powerful combos into play, Bug does the opposite. You will try to prevent your opponents from activating their main game plans. No matter what our opponent is doing, Bug has the answer. Are they using the graveyard? Deathrite Shaman. Powerful artifact combinations? We have Collector Roof. Maybe they're looking to draw a bunch of cards. Leovold and Orcish Bowmaster. When all else fails, we get to utilize the pitch cycle of forces to stop our opponent. Force of Will, Force of Negation, and Force of Vigor all act as 0 mana stopgaps to opponents' most powerful plays. Bug will start the game by identifying what is the opponent's game plan and how are you going to disrupt them. Playing Deathrite Shaman on turn 1 can let you produce efficient threats while all the while stopping your opponent with cards like Wasteland. Ideal scenario will be a turn 1 Deathrite Shaman into a turn 2 3-drop, Oko or Leovold, or even more powerful sometimes, a turn 1 Deathrite Shaman into a turn 2 Frog, to push forward our game plan, combined with a Wasteland to slow down our opponents. Typically, Bug is going to produce its greatest results when it is introduced into a field of Bazaar of Baghdad, Mishra's Workshop, and other combo decks. When the field is full of control and aggro, that can be when Bug struggles. Today's list from CRK, who won the Vintage Challenge with this 75 on 1013, is going to be our starting point for discussions. I'm going to go over the main matchups, our role in the matchups, and some ideas on how to sideboard, as well as some other cards you can put in your Bug deck. When building your own Bug deck, there's going to be important things to note. Number 1, blue count for Force of Will. You need to make sure there are enough blue spells in your deck so that your Force of Will can be reliably cast on turn 0. In this list, we can see 4, 9, 10, 14, 15, 21. Not a bad number. The higher you go, the more likely you are to have your Force of Will on turn 1. And a lot of times, Force of Will is going to be the most important on turn 1, especially when you are on the draw and you need to stop your opponent from resolving a critical combo spell. The second important thing to think about is the green count for Force of Vigor. Now, this is going to depend on how much you need to cast Force of Vigor on turn 1 in the metagame. How many Force of Vigors are you actually playing in your main or your side? It's okay to be a lot lower on your green count. This list, 4, 8, 10, 15, 16, is not going to reliably cast Force of Vigor on turn 1, but it might not need to. From there, we need to look at both our creatures and our spells. Our creatures are going to be stock and centered around Deathrite Shaman, Psychic Frog, and Collector Roof these days, but there's a lot of viable options that you could include in your deck. Things like Tarmogoyf have seen play in the past. Creatures for 2 mana that destroy artifacts or enchantments if it's the correct metagame for that. You might even play 3 mana cards like Hullbreacher that reliably do Leovold impression. You have a lot of versatility because you can truly play any 1 to 3 drop blue, black, or green creature in this deck. For removal, you want to be pretty wide range unless you have a good idea of what the metagame entails. This list is choosing to play Fatal Push and Abrupt Decay, but you could easily see Assassin's Trophy instead. In artifact-heavy metagames, I've even seen cards like Tear Asunder. Again, you have the breadth of the blue, green, and black color pie, and that features a lot of versatile and powerful removal spells. That's one of the reasons that this set of colors is selected for a fair, controlling deck. Counter magic can also play a big part, and this list is choosing to play 1 Fluster and 1 Spell Pierce. Some metagames might call for 2 Fluster Storms, some might call for 0. Some might call for 2 Spell Pierces, some might call for 0. I've heard people say this might be a nice metagame for Spell Snare with lots of 2-drops. You can see even in our deck, 14 2-drops. Psychic Frog being a big driver of 2-drops in the metagame. Something to keep in mind how your counterspell suite lines up against the metagame. So as you can see, we have a lot of different ways to build a bug deck because of the colors and because we are not currently restricted by Lurrus. That being said, you could build this deck as a Lurrus deck, cutting your Leovolds and your Okos and going more towards your 1 and 2-drops or more towards spells. It's definitely up in the air whether a Lurrus Deathrite Shaman deck is more powerful than a generic bug mid-range deck, and we'll have to see how that evolves as the format continues. Let's talk about some matchups. Here are the 11 most played decks in Vintage. We'll start off with Bug, the Bug Mirror. The Bug Mirror is going to be quite awkward. The reason it's awkward is because your deck is very tuned to stopping the rest of the field. Cards like Collector Roof have virtually no text in a Bug Mirror. Turning off Moxen is just simply not a high value play. That being said, you also won't have very many cards in your sideboard that are good for the Bug Mirror because of how pointed your deck is at beating the metagame. Looking at our sideboard here, we have, anti-artifact cards, anti-mono white cards, anti-graveyard cards, and only down here do we start to hit some different versatile removal spells. From the sideboard, I'd be looking to bring in Fatal Push and Assassin's Trophy, mainly to make sure we can keep our opponent's Psychic Frogs in check and have answers to opponent's Oko, Thief of Crowns. Taking cards out of this is going to be a challenge because obviously Collector Roof is poor card here, but we might even have some worse cards. Is Flusterstorm really going to be good against our opponent's deck full of creatures? What about Spell Pierce? While Spell Pierce isn't hitting a lot of cards, Oko can be one of the most pivotal cards in the matchup. Being able to possibly counter an Oko could lead to winning games. In this video series, I don't want to give you hard and fast sideboard guides. I don't want to say you take these in and you put these out, take these out, put these in. I want to just give you general ideas of things to be thinking about. One, because I am not an expert on every deck that we're going to talk about. And two, because from player to player and match to match, lists are going to be different. It's not always going to be the case. And I want you to be thinking about these little minute changes that might mean you don't bring in a card this time or that time. So that's going to be my general recommendation looking at this example list. And obviously, another thing is if you play a different bug list, you're going to have different numbers in your sideboard and your main. The things are not going to directly carry over unless you were to play exactly this 75 and you were being very rigid. That's not always a bad place to start, but it's not generally the idea I like to push when it comes to sideboard guides. Moving to our second deck, Countervine. Countervine is a Bazaar of Baghdad deck, and one of the decks that we should be pretty favored against. If you look here, this Countervine deck is going to mulligan to its pivotal card, Bazaar of Baghdad, and use that to gain card advantage by returning Master of Death and Squee from the yard and playing free creatures like Hollow One, Blazing Rootwalla, Basking Rootwalla to return Vengevine. A bunch of free counter magic will also follow. So, how do we want to play the matchup as Bug versus Countervine? We simply must attack their Bazaar of Baghdad as their main draw engine and their Graveyard as their main value engine. Cards in the main that are already going to be good here are things like Wasteland. Wasteland is one of the strongest cards along with Strip Mine at stopping Bazaar of Baghdad. You also have Beseiju as another way to disrupt Bazaar of Baghdad, though this one's a little bit slower. Deathrite Shaman can be pivotal in this matchup. Being able to eat the Bazaar of Baghdad out of the graveyard so that it can't get Noxious Revivaled is very important. This can also eat those pesky Vengevines and Master of Deaths and Squeeze. This card is very important. Once you have a stable board state and have removed the opponent's ability to gain card advantage, you can start picking off those creatures. It is going to be very important that you do have access to the green mana here to exile target creature from the graveyard. That being said, Fatal Push is not going to be very strong when the opponent's main threat is Hollow One and Vengevine. Though you can kill a Vengevine, this will be a little bit harder. Hollow One is the card we definitely want to be able to destroy with our removal spells. You can see the awkwardness here with Abrupt Decay, which is not going to kill Hollow One or Vengevine. That's the kind of card that you definitely want to take out in this matchup. Psychic Frog, on the other hand, is going to be very strong. Just a very large creature, hard to deal with, especially when you can resolve a creature versus Countervine. They don't have that many removal spells. Usually it's going to be something like some Furies in the sideboard, maybe some Snapbacks. That is not going to, a lot of their fighting is going to be on the stack. Orcish Bowmaster really shines in this matchup. where opponent has to draw cards and they're not going to replace their draw steps with dredges, as does cards like Leovold. Oko, on the other hand, while opponent is going to play a bunch of permanents, is a little bit clunky just because of its cost, and especially with how fast the opponent can be. Looking at our sideboard, we have some very strong options. I like Assassin's Trophy, as it answers not only Hollow 1 Vengevine, but it also can be targeted at a Bazaar of Baghdad. Tabernacle is almost entirely in vintage sideboards for Countervine. Tabernacle of the Pendrell Veil is not really for opposing creature decks, it's actually just for opposing Bazaar of Baghdad decks. You're going to bring this in, and your opponent's not going to have the mana to pay for any of their free creatures that they put into play. Force of Vigor, not going to do it here. These are anti-mono white cards, and obviously Leyline of the Void, going to be a premium in this matchup, and any matchup with Bazaar of Baghdad for that matter. So, we're going to be looking to bring in cards like Tabernacle, Assassin's Trophy, and Leyline of the Void, and take out cards that don't have targets. Things like Abrupt Decay, Fatal Push possibly, and Force of Negation and Force of Vigor. Force of Negation especially. Opponent's going to use all of their spells on our turn, not their turn, so we won't even have targets for Force of Negation. That being said, as you could probably tell by the amount of cards I talked about in the main that were good against this deck, this is one of our best matchups in the format. We have all kinds of ways to disrupt our opponent's game plan and efficient beaters to outsize their 4/4s. Next deck is Doomsday, the premier combo deck of the format. Bug is actually well suited to battle against Doomsday. Doomsday has quite a few vulnerabilities that Bug can exploit. The Doomsday player is looking to cast Dark Ritual, use the black mana to cast Doomsday, making their deck exactly 5 cards, drawing through those cards with Ancestral Recall and Gush, and playing a Thassa's Oracle with an empty library. Now, the Bug player has some options here to try to restrict that game plan. Obviously, we have the stack. We have Force of Will, Negation, Flusterstorm, Pierce, and Mental Misstep in this case to fight on the stack. But we also have some interesting options on fighting the opponent's card draw. We have Orcish Bowmaster, Leovold that can affect an opponent's ability to card draw. Orcish Bowmaster is going to punish them for card drawing, while Leovold will stop them entirely. And Doomsday is pretty compact. It can be vulnerable to cards like Wasteland. Attacking the opponent's Underground Seas can make it hard to have enough mana to cast Dark Ritual, cast Doomsday, and still cantrip afterwards. Using cards like Wasteland and Boseiju to attack the mana base can be beneficial. And even Collector Oof can be useful in slowing down your opponent's game plan. A lot of Doomsday piles will use Black Lotus to play the Thassa's Oracle on the same exact turn that they break the pile. Collector Oof may be able to slow that down. Not always. Savvy Doomsday pilots can build piles that include Time Walk and can actually get the Thassa's Oracle through a Collector Roof on the same turn. Generally, not the same turn they cast the Doomsday, however. So, one of the main thing Bug can do is make it so the Doomsday player has to play a pass-the-turn pile. A pass-the-turn pile is when the Doomsday player can't go through the entire 5 cards in the same turn that they cast the Doomsday, and have to give you, the opponent, a turn before they can break through the pile. By giving a turn to a Bug player, you expose yourself as the Doomsday pilot to a variety of things that can go wrong. If too many lands get destroyed on the pass the turn pile and you didn't put enough lands in your 5-card pile, you could lose that way. If your opponent didn't have a Collector Roof in play, but you still had to make a pass the turn pile, and then they played a Collector Roof, turning off the Black Lotus in your pile, you might not have enough lands to play your mana to play your Thassa's Oracle that way. If you built a pile that has a bunch of draw spells like Ancestral and Gush, and you pass the turn into an opponent who is on Bug, who plays a Leovold, that might disrupt the pile as well. So you can see there's a lot of different ways as the Bug player you have to interact with your Doomsday opponents. In the sideboard, you're going to run into an issue where you are likely not going to have a lot of cards. You may have things like Mindbreak Trap, Force of Negation, Flusterstorms, Archive Traps, those kind of cards. Or you might have your sideboard overwhelmed with things you need for other matchups. In this case, only one card was probably coming in the matchup, Force of Negation, and you can look to take out something that doesn't have a lot of targets, like a removal spell. It's worth noting that Doomsday players can sometimes bring in creatures post-board, so you want to have your most versatile removal spells in. Cards like Fatal Push and Abrupt Decay are not very good here. You can instead bring in Assassin's Trophy, which can target your opponent's lands, which can be very important. An Assassin's Trophy in a pass the turn pile might be enough to disrupt them from casting their Thassa's Oracle. while also being able to hit cards like Shieldred or Murktide Regent from the sideboard. That being said, you're not always very worried about creatures from the sideboard because you probably have to keep in your Okos anyways. Your Okos are not going to be particularly strong in this matchup, but they do have a nice catch-all answer to random creatures that Doomsday could bring in. Psychic Frog is another important card to mention in the matchup. Psychic Frog is just a ticking time bomb for a Doomsday player. If you can resolve a Psychic Frog and make it to your next turn where you get to untap with your mana, you can be put in a very strong position where you're going to draw your answers and your wastelands, whereas your opponent is going to have to do some serious math. Doomsday takes half of the opponent's life total to resolve, and so a frog can quickly discard. You can quickly discard your hand to a frog and one tap an opposing player who did a Doomsday past the turn pile. It's going to be one of the more interesting matchups in the format, in my opinion. Get ready and get excited for Doomsday versus Bug. Going back towards good matchups, we have Dredge, the Bazaar of Baghdad premier deck in the format. Dredge is an all-in graveyard combo deck utilizing Bazaar of Baghdad and Dredge mechanic, replacing draw steps to put cards in the graveyard. This is one of your best matchups as a Bug player. You have lots of the best answers in the format to stopping Dredge. Mainly, you have Wasteland and Strip Mine and Boseiju to kill Bazaar of Baghdad. Your Deathrite Shaman does double duty by eating creatures out of your opponent's graveyard. If you can make it to a point where they're slow dredging after, you Wasteland their Bazaar, and then they have to dredge once a turn, you can eat the cards that come out. One of the main things you can do is eat a Narcomoeba with a trigger on the stack. A variety of different ways of eating creatures can be extremely powerful in the matchup. If you have Assassin's Trophy in your main, you could always use that as well to target your opponent's Bazaar of Baghdad. If you are on the play and you resolve a turn 1, let's say, or Leovold or Bowmaster, that can be very good. But just note that if your opponent can dredge, it will replace the draw step, and Leovold and Bowmasters won't be good in that case. Demonic Tutor can be very important in this matchup too, as it's going to help you find your wastelands. But if you don't have a wasteland in game 1, it can be very challenging. The key card in this matchup is going to be disrupting their Bazaar of Baghdad. If, however, you have to go to game 2 and 3, you have the all-powerful Leyline of the Void coming into play on turn 0 and immediately turning off your opponent's graveyard. Leyline of the Void is the premier hate card against Dredge. You will also, of course, bring in that Assassin's Trophy that we talked about, as well as Tabernacle of the Pendril Veil. Tabernacle disrupts all of Dredge's creatures except for Icarid. Icarid being a haste creature that comes into play and then leaves play all in the same turn. This will stop Narcomoeba and Amalgam and Silver Smoke Ghoul and Hollow One. So this is another matchup where you are definitely bringing in the Church. So yeah, Tabernacle, Assassin's Trophy, Leyline of the Void, and then cards that come out are things that just don't have targets. Again, Collect Roof against Dredge has no artifacts. Don't want to Collect Roof here. Fatal Push is going to have no targets. Abrupt Decay is going to have basically no targets. That's why a card like Assassin's Trophy is a bit more versatile and can be very good into certain metagames where you don't care about things like uncounterability. Mental Misstep is a card you can think about keeping or not keeping, as it's going to counter Noxious Revival, so I'd like to keep it in. Noxious Revival is Dredge's main way to counteract your Wastelands, so if you have a Mental Misstep for Noxious Revival, it can be a game-winning play. This matchup is pretty simple. It's all about stopping your opponent from doing the Dredge thing. If you can do that, you can attack them with creatures in any way you deem fit and end the game that way. We had a good matchup. Now it's time for a bad one. Mono White Initiative is a matchup that really tests the Bug player's sideboarding. Mono White Initiative, an aggro deck that plays cheap, undercosted initiative creatures and goes way over the top of your Bug creatures. If your opponent is playing a White Plume Adventure and you're playing Collector Roof, the White Plume Adventure is going to end up on top. Not only does the Mono White deck play powerful creatures accelerated out under, fast, it also plays a plethora of Swords to Plowshares as removal for your creatures. This matchup can be extremely challenging and was one of the reasons that Bug actually fell off a bit in metagames of the past. You do have some solid cards for the matchup in things like Psychic Frog, Fatal Push in the main, Oko if you can resolve it fast enough. But one of the things that's going to be very challenging is you're always going to be on the back foot because of how much mana acceleration your opponent plays. That being said, if you can answer their fast plays, you're going to have a better time in the long run. You can see that CRK's list here respects Mono White Initiative quite a lot in the sideboard. You have Fatal Pushes and Assassin's Trophies to bring in as extra removal, but you also have protection from white Knight of Infamy. Very hard for the mono white deck to remove a Knight of Infamy. This can be enough to steal the initiative or be a brick wall. This card can single-handedly win you the mono white matchup. You also have a card like Virtue's Ruin in the sideboard. 3 mana, destroy all white creatures. These are very narrow, very powerful answers that should give you an indication of just how bad the matchup truly is. Sideboarding out can be a little difficult. Definitely don't want to be fighting on the stack. Though, it can be important to note that if you know your opponent is going to be on mono white initiative, using your Force of Wills and Force of Negations aggressively on their fast mana in their Moxins and Mana Crypt and Lotus can be a way to slow your opponent down enough for you to get a Deathrite Shaman in there and start wastelanding. Something that we haven't talked about a ton so far is that some matchups in Vintage, Deathrite Shaman's exile target land to gain a color mana will always be on, and some matchups it won't be. Mono white can be a matchup where your opponent plays a basic plains and doesn't have any fetches, and your Deathrite Shaman might not be turned on unless you have fetches of your own and wastelands of your own. It's important to know and keep track of when you have the ability to make mana with Deathrite Shaman and when to conserve that resource. You have a lot of cards to bring in. Take out some of the cards that are poorer. I really like the idea of Collector Roof on the play versus mono white because you can play a Collector Roof on turn 1 possibly and turn off some of their fast mana, which can give you a foothold in the race. But it's overall not a super strong card. I would be looking more at things like Counter Magic and Forces and a Force of Vigor. Mental Misstep is an interesting one because your opponent has Swords of Plowshares, one of the most powerful cards in the matchup, but nothing else besides that. Something to consider there. Flusterstorm will have very few targets, and Spell Pierce maybe is useful on the play to stop that fast mana, but on the draw, maybe not at all. I don't have a great grasp of what comes in and out here, but those are kind of things to think about. Definitely want to bring in removal and anti-mono white cards, but what do you take out? That's going to be a little bit more pick and choose. Back towards combo decks, we have Jewel Shops. Jewel Shops is going to be a deck that we have a lot of tools to beat, but it can be challenging depending on the opponent's draw. A Jewel Shops deck is a Mishra's Workshop artifact combo deck. It's looking to play turn 1 the One Ring or turn 2 Coveted Jewel and then draw through its deck by copying Coveted Jewel with Phyrexian Metamorph, picking up those cards with Paradoxical Outcome. It has just enough blue cards to reliably cast Force of Will to protect its spells and stop you from doing your thing. And in the sideboard, it's going to have a lot of answers to you because of this can be a kind of a challenging matchup. You can see these Dismembers here and these Argenta Masticores. Those are definitely coming in because of you. Now, why are they coming in because of you? This is the one right here. Collector Roof. Activated abilities of artifacts can't be activated. Their whole deck doesn't really work if you have a Collector Roof in play. So it's imperative that they counter Collector Roof or remove Collector Roof. This is your card you're looking for in the matchup. You want to find Collector Roof. You want to be able to protect it with forces. Utilize Wastelands to stop your opponent from being able to play 5 and 6 drop creatures, hitting the Mishra's Workshop and the Ancient Tombs. But Collector Roof is the one. Leovold can actually be really powerful here too, making so your opponent can't draw cards with the One Ring and Coveted Jewel. Getting an early creature in play can be very important. If you get an early creature in play, it's a lot harder for the opponent to cast Coveting Jewel. They have to make sure they cast Coveted Jewel in a turn where they're going to combo off for sure. Because if they cast Coveted Jewel and can't combo off, then you can attack and steal the Coveted Jewel with your creature. So it's very important here to have different pieces of combo hate as well as cards that are going to stop the opponent from doing their primary game plan. Oko is okay here. It's definitely useful in turning off a One Ring. They will still, of course, draw up to at least one card, but maybe more if they have Voltaic Key or Manifold Key. But definitely a useful tool in stopping the One Ring. In the sideboard, we have some options. I would love to bring in a Force of Negation as a way to counter a turn 1 Ring or Jewel. Force of Vigor can be pretty powerful here, depending on their exact draw. If they have like a One Ring, obviously this doesn't help that much, but if they have different sets of mana, you can definitely get some value with a Force of Vigor. Energy Flux is not always amazing versus Jewel. If they kill you in one turn, the Energy Flux doesn't matter very much. But because we're going to disrupt their mana with Collector Roof, Energy Flux can be a nice 1-2 punch with our Collector Roof. You make it so they can't pay any mana, and then we wipe out all of their mana in one go with the Energy Flux. Definitely want to bring in the Energy Flux in this matchup specifically. And those are the cards I would like to bring in. Flusterstorm is, a little bit weak here. They do have some powerful spells, but they're not the linchpin of the thing. If you of the deck, if you think you need to definitely be able to counter the Force of Will, maybe you would keep in the Flusterstorm, but possibly not. Mental Misstep, does have a few big targets with Ancestral Recall and Manifold and Voltaic Key, but that's few and far between. Don't know if it's worth keeping a Mental Misstep in just for those cards. You have to be careful with which creatures you deploy, as your opponent can play Phyrexian Metamorph to copy your creatures. Don't want to play a Psychic Frog and have your opponent copy it with Metamorph and have their frog be bigger than yours, and things go awry that way. I would definitely look at cards like Fatal Push to remove, but Abrupt Decay and Assassin's Trophy can become a little bit more powerful by being able to, well, this one destroys lands, but you could also hit different pieces of artifact mana. Definitely a matchup you are excited to see because you are a Force deck and you are a pseudo Null Rod deck with your Collector Oofs. On to the most played deck in the format, Lurrus Control. Right now, looking like Lurrus Control is a struggle for Bug, but we'll have to see how that adapts. Bug obviously has ways to make the matchup better based on which threats it's playing versus which removal Lurrus Control plays, and Lurrus Control does play different removal based on which version you're playing against. Here, we have a nice blue-black version, playing Fatal Push as its removal spell, along with Spell Pierce as a counter magic, and 7 forces. This one is going to use Mishra's Bauble pretty heavily as a card draw engine, but also has access to things like Ponder, Bowmaster, and Frog. So, a challenging matchup because you have cards that may or may not be good depending on what's in your opponent's deck. Collector Roof, if your opponent has a bunch of Moxen and Mishra's Baubles, then it can actually be really strong. But if they have a draw that's Fatal Pushes and Ponders and those kind of things, then it might not be. Abrupt Decay is probably in this particular list main because of Lurrus Saga. Being an uncounterable kill spell against Psychic Frog and Lurrus is extremely important. Deathrite Shaman is an interesting one in this matchup because you can start to take away cards from the opponent's graveyard that they could recur. Your removal spells, Fatal Push and Abrupt Decay, do not exile, so they could be brought back with Lurrus later in the game. Deathrite Shaman might be able to eat those cards, along with being able to eat spells to keep your opponent away from casting their Delve spells, Dig Through Time, and Treasure Cruise. It's going to be a Psychic Frog battle, and I think you should have some of the tools you need to put up a good fight. Wasteland at key times can be important into tempoing your opponent out of this game, and you do have a nice set of removal. Resolving an Oko is going to be extremely powerful, but resolving the Oko is going to be very hard with your opponent's counterspell suite. Oko does have some problems with Psychic Frog, where a Psychic Frog that gets a bunch of counters and becomes an elk is going to become very large. However, a very large creature you might still be able to just deal with your specific removal suite. Leovold's going to be really nice here, where your opponent's not going to be able to draw cards, and if they start to hit you with Bowmasters or Wastelands, you can draw cards of your own. Honestly, I'm not exactly sure why the data is currently so bad for Bug versus Lurrus Saga. I feel like you should have a very reasonable time versus Lurrus. Maybe I'll have to ask some players what they think. But I don't know if you would play this deck into a Lurrus metagame if you didn't think it at least had a playable matchup there. Depending on which Lurrus deck, they might have Fatal Pushes or they might have Swords to Plowshares. And then the white version of the deck might have some different removal spells like Prismatic Ending, which might be very good against your resolved Oko. Coming in from the sideboard, I'd be interested in things like more removal spells. The blue-black Lurrus deck doesn't really get going if it doesn't have Frog and it doesn't have Lurrus. So being able to kill Lurrus or Frog can be very important. Fatal Push and Assassin's Trophies will help there. Definitely don't want to bring in our anti-white cards here, even if they do play white. And then all of these other cards don't have a lot of text in the matchup. So maybe the issue is more, we have all of these cards to beat the graveyard and to beat mono white, but we don't have extra cards to bring in for Lurrus. That's quite possible, but I do think that removal is one of the best ways to stop the current Lurrus deck, as it's not really a cantripping deck like in Legacy. In Legacy, you have 4 Brainstorm, you have 4 Ponder to support your Psychic Frog game plan. In Vintage, you don't get to play as many of those type of effects, and so a Psychic Frog that is destroyed and doesn't come back is going to be a significant blow to the Lurrus player's game plan. Next up is going to be a pretty interesting matchup in Oath of Druids. Oath of Druids is a combo deck that typically thrives against opposing creature decks, but against Bug, it can be a little more dicey. Oath of Druids is a symmetrical enchantment that is going to trigger and resolve when the opposing player has more creatures than you do. This is going to be put into play, and then if you have a creature and they don't, they're going to put an Atraxa into play. Atraxa is going to be immediately a huge problem, as it is a 7/7 flying vigilance, death touch, lifelink, and will get them 5/7 cards. They can even play around you playing no creatures by using Forbidden Orchard to give you creature tokens. Besides that, this is a pretty much all-in fast combo deck. Lots of fast mana, counter spells, even plays Show and Tell as an additional way to put Atraxa in. It is an Oko Thief of Crowns mirror match, but you have some good options here. And some of the reason is because you are one of the best decks at removing enchantments. Oath of Druids is going to take a full turn to put a creature into play. They're going to play an Oath. They have to pass to you. You play your turn, pass to them. The conditions of Oath of Druids have to be met, and then the creature will enter the battlefield. So we have a lot of time to disrupt that. Beseiju is an uncounterable way to attack an enchantment. Abrupt Decay as well. Destroy a 9-land permanent with mana 3 or less. Cannot be countered. So between Vigor, Abrupt Decay, Assassin's Trophy, Beseiju, you actually have a lot of answers to the card Oath of Druids. Show and Tell, again, you have your pieces of counter magic, Force of Will, Force of Negation, Flusterstorm, and Spell Pierce, so you can fight the Show and Tell on the stack. And even when it comes down to it, Oko can be a catch-all answer to an Atraxa that resolves. Elking and Atraxa sometimes is enough to, you can fight through the triggers. Maybe they have a weaker Atraxa trigger, you Oko it, and then you find an answer on your next turn to the Oath, and all you have to deal with is an Elk and the cards that they already drew. That's some wishful thinking, but it is a thing that can happen. Oko is definitely a card you want to resolve early in the matchup if possible. It's also worth noting that Oath of Druids is that weird symmetrical effect where if your opponent has more creatures than you do, you would get the Oath trigger, or they won't get the Oath trigger. So Okoing opponent's Moxen can be a way to slow down or stop an Oath trigger. Lots of counterplay and intricacies in that matchup. Psychic Frog, while a vulnerability in the fact that it will trigger your opponent's Oath, is an inevitable and scary card draw engine for your deck. And an early Psychic Frog can really put the pressure on the Oath player to combo and end the game quickly. Like I said, Force of Vigor, Assassin's Trophy are cards that will definitely come in this matchup, as well as Force of Negation. Collector Oof on the play can be pretty interesting as a way to turn off opponent's fast mana, but it can be a very big liability in terms of turning on your opponent's Oath of Druids if they don't have Forbidden Orchard. So Collector Oof is a kind of a hit or miss card in the matchup. On the draw, maybe a card you want to start trimming a bunch of copies of. Obviously, Fatal Push is going to have very few targets against the almost creatureless opponent's deck, so I would definitely get rid of these Fatal Pushes. Assassin's Trophy, a much more versatile threat. It can actually destroy an Atraxa if it needed to, but it can also hit that Oath of Druids or even an opponent's land. So you have a lot of different options here. I would definitely look to trim these oofs and these Fatal Pushes and keep in as much counter magic and versatile cards as possible. Moving down the list to Paradoxical Outcome and in general Tinker strategies, these combo decks are always going to be a decent matchup for you. You have options and you have good cards in the matchup, especially depending on how PO decks start to build themselves in the future. Here is an example PO list. Basically a combo deck that's going to use Moxen to play Paradoxical Outcome, picking up those Moxen and replaying those Moxen over and over again, drawing through the deck and winning with Monastery Mentor and Time Walk, or sometimes Bolas Citadel, activate, sack, Yogwill, bring back Bolas Citadel, and activate, sack. This matchup is historically a bit of a back and forth. At one point in time, it was actually PO favored because they played a bunch of dress downs to turn off your hateful creatures. These days, lots of Swords to Plowshares can be a bit challenging. You have good tools here, though. And while Monastery Mentor itself is a threat, that's very, much a restricted magic card, and they won't always come down. Your main card in this matchup is going to be Collector Roof. Collector Roof is going to stop your opponent's main combo engine. Turning off their fast mana and wastelanding their actual lands can be quite devastating and immediately turn off your opponent's ability to play the game. Psychic Frog is a great addition for this matchup, where it's a kind of must counter, must remove threat that you can play and start threatening your opponents by having just much more card advantage than them. Oko is a bit weird, where it is theoretically good. You can turn off their Moxen, maybe turn off the Metalcraft by turning artifacts into Elks. And if they whiff on a Citadel, you could turn that into an Elk. But in general, Oko's going to be a little bit slow, a little bit clunky. Leovold and Orcish Bowmasters, however, are fantastic. A lot of the paradoxical outcome engine is based on drawing cards. That being said, while we're talking about paradoxical outcome, it could always be an Esper Tinker deck and not an Esper Paradoxical Outcome deck. Cutting the PO and playing more generic cards, maybe even more Swords to Plowshares, would make the matchup a little bit more challenging for you. It is nice that you have Boseiju as an answer to a Tinker Bolas's Citadel, as well as sometimes Tinker for Sphinx of the Steel Wind. It has pro green, which can be extremely challenging for your deck to cut through. When I think about this matchup, I think about Force of Negation, Force of Vigor as cards to bring in. I don't think about bringing in Energy Flux, but it's not unreasonable either. One of the problems with bringing in Energy Flux against a dedicated PO deck is they could always put the Energy Flux triggers on the stack and then pick all the cards up with PO. That can be mitigated by having a Collector Roof in play and then wiping out the artifacts that way with Flux. But it's probably not a terrible idea if you have cards that you think you need to board out. Fatal Push is going to have extremely low targets here. So Fatal Push, an easy card to take out in this kind of matchup. Maybe you don't need 3 Okos in this matchup. It all kind of depends on what you want to have in terms of cards that come out versus cards that come in. Definitely more important to have Force of Vigor, Force of Negation coming in than having Energy Flux come in. All the way down in number 10 here, Sphere Shops. This is one of the decks that you should be preying on as a bug player. Sphere Shops can be aggro or prison-oriented decks that are using Mishra's Workshop, the Broken Land, to make 3 mana and cast artifact spells ahead of curve. There are a lot of different ways that you can build a Mishra's Workshop Sphere deck, but in general, the bug deck is just going to have a really strong set of answers. The existence of Deathrite Shaman to make sure that you always have mana is going to really stunt their plan of disrupting your mana base. Collector Oof, not always the best card in the matchup, but can be pretty strong at turning off certain artifact draws from them. Don't get too hung up on Collector Oof, though. It's not like your opponent needs artifact mana to function. They're even a deck that plays main deck Null Rod. But Collector Roof can be an annoying one, and Frog is absolutely outstanding against Workshop decks. They don't really have good answers to Frog, so once a Frog is in play, it can take over the game by itself. You have the stopgaps of Force of Will, Force of Negation, and Force of Vigor to counter turn 1 Spheres and Crucibles and those kind of cards. Your opponent's going to try to just restrict your mana with Sphere Resistance, making your spells cost more, Crucible returning Wasteland. But you have Disruption. Deathrite Shaman can eat the lands out of their yard so they can't Wasteland loop you, and also makes mana to help pay for Sphere effects. You have different kinds of ways to remove artifacts with Abrupt Decay, Boseiju, Force of Vigor, Assassin's Trophy, and you have the ultimate Haymaker, Energy Flux. Playing an Energy Flux against a Mishra's Workshop Sphere deck is always extremely hard for the opponent to battle through. They can battle through it theoretically by, using their Golos to find a Tolarian Academy and making mana that way. But a lot of time, being able to resolve an Energy Flux is going to be a game-winning spell in the matchup. That being said, it is a 3-mana spell that will start costing more based on your opponent's Sphere resistances, so it's always a bit of a challenge to make sure this can get into play. Oko has a similar problem where it is a 3-mana spell, so it is hard to play, but when it does get into play, it's going to be extremely hard for your opponent to battle against. Basically, you have a bunch of the best tools in the for the matchup, and it's going to allow you to have a very good time against most Sphere decks. So Energy Fluxes, Force of Vigor, Force of Negation, Assassin's Trophy probably coming in, and then Collector Roof probably coming out, especially on the draw. Maybe some of your more clunky cards will come out. Maybe Orcish Bowmaster comes out, as it's not really affecting your opponent because they're not trying to draw extra cards. Leovold is actually decent against opponents' Wastelands, but they are also, again, not trying to draw extra cards. Flusterstorm has almost no targets, and by almost no targets, I mean actual no targets. Same with Misstep having very few targets as well. So you have some cards you can cut out there. Keep in mind that when you start cutting these dead cards like Flusterstorm and Mental Misstep, you need to make sure that you have to keep up your blue count for your Force of Will. because it is very important, especially on the draw, to be able to force will your opponent's first sphere. Think about it. If your opponent plays a sphere, how are you going to deploy a Deathrite Shaman when it costs 2 mana? And so you have to play the slower game. Your opponent starts to wasteland you out. Say you didn't have a fetch land. You just have to play a tropical island. Your opponent wastelands it, and you're already behind an extreme amount of mana. That's how you would typically lose this matchup, is if your opponent starts to lock you out of your ability to play spells. On to the 11th and final matchup, Underworld Breach. Underworld Breach is another reasonable matchup for Bug, mostly because their combo is affected by your hate pieces. Their combo is an Underworld Breach in combination with Black Lotus or Lotus Petal and the card Brain Freeze. Basically, they mill over cards in their graveyard, and then they can replay them with the escape cost of Underworld Breach, replaying Black Lotus and replaying Brain Freeze, milling over their deck over and over again, and then milling over all of your cards and casting Ancestral Recall, targeting you to end the game. Typically, these decks are going to play Tinker and Bolas's Citadel as an alternative combo kill, as well as Hull Breacher plus Wheel and Time Twister effects. So there's a couple of different things to look out for. This isn't the only way to build Breach. You could also have a Lurrus opponent who wants to play a Breach deck. Obviously, they're going to forego Hull Breachers and Bolas's Citadel, but still play the core combo of Underworld Breach and Brain Freeze and be a little bit more spell dense. One of the nice parts about this matchup is Collector Oof is going to turn off the Black Lotus and Lotus Petal and make the Underworld Breach combo a little bit harder to execute. That being said, Underworld Breach can still flash back removal spells, and removing a Collector Oof is not the hardest thing to do. One of the problems in this matchup is actually going to be Underworld Breach is one of the few red decks in the format right now playing Pyroblast. Pyroblast is going to be a very efficient answer for your Psychic Frog, Oko, Leovold, and Forces. A nice part about this is going to be Deathrite Shaman eating cards from your opponent's yard. It's not always going to be perfect because you can't eat Black Lotus. You can only eat creatures and instants and sorceries. But eating certain instants and sorceries out of your opponent's yard can make it very hard for them to have the necessary cards to play the escape costs and combo off that way. Also worth thinking about, Abrupt Decay is an uncounterable way to destroy a Underworld Breach. So if your opponent plays an Underworld Breach and then casts a spell, that spell goes on the stack, and you'll have an opportunity to destroy the Breach uncounterably. That can be a very efficient way at stopping their combo. A lot of times, those decks are going to play 4 Ponders and a lot of cantrips, so Orcish Bowmaster and Leovold come into play there. Just be aware that you need to make sure that you don't get end of turn Hull Breacher into Time Twistered. That will discard your hand, and they'll draw 7 and get a bunch of treasures. In the matchup, you probably are looking at things like Negation, possibly. Depending on how artifact heavy they are, maybe a Force of Vigor. Assassin's Trophy might be a nice catch-all answer. It'll hit, a Resolve Tinker for a Citadel. It can kill a Hull Breacher, and it can kill a Underworld Breach. So that might make a lot of sense. Take a look at your removal suite, see how it lines up against the creatures they're playing. They might play Hull Breachers, but they might not. They might play a Lurrus deck and have lots of Psychic Frogs and other cards to go with their Breach plan. In that case, maybe you do need more removal. And that's kind of something to keep in mind, is that you need to evaluate every matchup individually. Sometimes the things that I say here are not going to really line up against your opponent's version of the stock deck. So I do like this matchup, though. As a Bug player, you have lots of different tools, but it's always worth noting that these favorable combo matchups can go horribly awry because your opponent is playing a much more powerful deck than yours. We have a lot lower power level cards, but we can disrupt their game plan a lot easier. So, if your opponent has the turn 1 Tinker with Force backup, sometimes you just die. And that's vintage. You just have to roll with it. Sometimes you just get vintaged. That being said, Underworld Breach, very specifically, actually, I would say both Tinker and Lurrus variants should be a matchup where you have a lot of tools to attack. I really like the idea of Abrupt Decay in this matchup. So get out there. Oh, I guess one more thing to talk about in that matchup is Leyline of the Void. Do you want to bring in Leyline of the Void because Underworld Breach is a graveyard-based combo? And the answer is sometimes. It's not a straightforward thing. If you look at this deck, you have to think, like, how many times are they actually going to use Breach as their primary kill plan? Sometimes they could just use Citadel with Brain Freeze and mill you out that way. Or maybe a Hull Breacher plus a Wheel is enough to beat you. nowadays, with only one Saga, there's, that takes away one of their alternate game plans to beat a Leyline of the Void, and this deck is not playing a lot of ways to beat a Leyline of the Void. So it's possible that maybe bringing in a Leyline of the Void has utility versus this specific version of Breach, whereas other versions it might not. Let's take a look at this Jeskai Lurrus version of Breach. Now, would you bring in Leyline here? It certainly seems like it's stronger here. And this deck actually respects Leyline a little bit with a Seal of Cleansing in the main as a way to remove it. That being said, with only one Urza Saga and a Lurrus, it's a lot harder to utilize your graveyard, only plan. You actually see a fourth Airlingas as a different way of an alternative way of winning outside of the graveyard. So it's tough because you want to maybe bring in Leyline here, but they are also maybe ready for Leyline. So it's a little bit here and there. And then what cards are you taking out? Most of our cards in this matchup are going to be very strong, but in this case, maybe you can take out the Fatal Pushes, and if you have extra slots, maybe you bring in some Leylines. It's not really a straightforward answer. It's more, like I said, it's more of a deck to deck, instance to instance, match to match kind of question. And you always need to be asking yourself, oh, is this maybe a time where I would or wouldn't do such a thing? And that wraps up our 11 most common matchups in Vintage. Hopefully, this information gives you the knowledge you need to start battling with Vintage's most fair blue deck. To wrap up the video, I have an exciting gameplay section. Enjoy. Okay, welcome to our first match of Vintage Vanguard. I am playing Bug up against Florida Legacy, who is typically an Oath player. I'd love to see an Oath matchup. I think that matchup is very interesting. I think this hand is probably keepable. Let's give it a shot. Let's take a quick peek at what our opponent's working with here. Okay, so our opponent has an Oath, has a Force and a Flash, a Demonic Tutor, and lands. So not a fast play from the opponent, but they do have a counterspell. What do we want to threaten on turn 1 here? Kind of awkward. Kind of an awkward set of cards. Now that I think about it, was this possibly a mulligan? I look back at our hand now and we have Underground Sea Black Lotus. Really interesting. Don't know. We're definitely going to deploy a 3-drop. It'll be interesting to see if our opponent counters our Oko. And then we have to make a choice of, are we actually playing Collector? So they do counter it. We talked a little bit in the prelude about how Oko was one of the more powerful cards in the matchup. Normally, I'd love to slam a Collector Roof, but I feel like I'm so far behind if I do that. I don't really like the idea very much. Maybe we just won't have the tools to move forward. Thinking back, like, was this hand a mulligan? God, it feels hard to say that it was a mulligan, but we might just get overpowered by the cards in our opponent's hand. Don't actually have a mental misstep target. We need to draw a land to play Leovold. Even if we play Leovold, they just get to Oath us. Though, it should be noted that there is an interesting interaction with Oath and Leovold, where Oath trigger is always mandatory and will trigger the Leovold. That being said, we're going to be in trouble. Our opponent has the Orchard, so they just get to slam an Oath here. And we don't actually have any way to deal with it right now. And we don't even have any green mana, so we're just going to lose. Now that I think about it, maybe this hand was a mulligan. Wow, very interesting. This is a nice little example, though, of how... Oh, yeah, I guess that's fine. It doesn't really matter. But it's an example of how sometimes your hateful pieces just don't line up in the right way. You have to be able to beat a lot of, very large matchup spread in Vintage. And sometimes it just doesn't work out. Here, my opponent plays an Oath, and I actually don't have answers to this with the current mana situation. Looking back, if I expected my opponent to be on Oath, maybe I needed to mulligan my opening hand. Well, we can try to play it out at least. Fetching up a Tropical here, play a Leovold. That way we can draw a card, and maybe we'll find both an answer to Atraxa and an answer to the Oath. Could be very hard to have that be the case, especially with an Oko already being countered, but at least our opponent will target us with Oath, and we'll get to draw a card. Orcish Bowmaster, not great. All right, they flipped over the Atraxa. I know they still have a Demonic Tutor, but they don't have a lot of mana. It's not like they can just immediately get... Oh, wow. The 10 cards they revealed are quite powerful. Ancestral, I guess, is turned off by Leovold, but they do have a Show and Tell and an Atraxa. Into the Floodmaw could bounce Leovold, but then they can't take an Ancestral. They have a Beseiju. Pretty interesting. I still think we just don't have the right cards to battle here. They took Atraxa Show, Delta Mox, and Into the Floodmaw. No force. So I guess what they can do is Demonic for... Well, they don't have Time Walk. They drew with Jet. So actually now they can Demonic for a Time Walk because they drew a Jet. Wow. That is unfortunate. I feel like if I was them, I would take a Demonic Tutor and I would go for a Time Walk and I would make sure I get another Atraxa trigger. Yeah, it looks bad. Again, this goes back to Discipline Mulliganing. I didn't even put a second thought into keeping my hand, and maybe I should have. All right, we get another Leovold trigger here, but it's going to be too much. It's going to be far too much. The way these Oath decks are positioned now, one Atraxa trigger is usually enough for them to overpower you, and there's not much you can do about it once it happens. Like, there would be possibly an instance where, you know, I draw a card, I draw an Oko, and then I draw a Beseiju, and I hit their Oath, and I turn off their Atraxa, but well, the Time Walk went to Yard and just did a Yogwill. Interesting. Ox Pearl Show and Tell. Traxa, and they kept. Well, now they have City plus Show and Tell. And they get to hit us with a 7/7 Flying Lifelink Death Touch. I don't know if you... Citadel, I should say, not City. I don't know if you... They don't have Force, though, which is kind of interesting. Into the Floodmaw. We draw a card. I'll just counter it. The problem is, like, we really don't have anything else that's great. Thoughtseize. Yeah, I could like force this Thoughtseize, but like I said, I don't actually have cards that matter. I don't have an answer to Oath still. So they probably just take the Force. Yeah. We are at a very precarious life total here. Do they have an Oko? Or are they going to show? Do they show a Citadel? Or do they show another Atraxa, though? Did they put an Atraxa in their hand? They might not actually have an Atraxa in their hand. It's a little hard to keep track of what they have going on here. What gives me the highest chance of winning? I guess I'm going to put Collector Oof in play, because I can't draw cards for Bowmaster anyways. I don't really, I don't have high hopes for this game, but, because now we have to answer a Citadel, an Oath, and an Atraxa. Though, if our opponent is on Yogwill and not Gaia's Blessing, maybe they get scared at some point here and don't continue to use their Oaths. We drew a Psychic Frog. A Psychic Frog does block an Atraxa for a turn, so that's something. And then Demonic and Yogwill are already used, so Black Mana doesn't really matter. Vampiric Tutor off of their Citadel to put a Force on top, I assume. Yeah, okay. They have like a million life to work with because of Atraxa. There's not much counterplay here besides... Oh, see, if I actually probably needed to hold the Wasteland so I could play so I could play an Oko. If I drew an Oko off the top. I didn't even think about that. But I do have 2 draws, so... There's my Underground Sea. Easy. Alright, so they didn't activate the Atraxa. So now we're in a spot where if we draw an Oko and turn this into an Elk, I feel like we have some amount of counterplay at this point. Another Oath. Interesting, into Leovold. I guess they're just playing cards off the top for Citadel. All they really need to do is find another Force on top to be able to counter my Oko, and then they're home free. But it's nice because we did have outs in this game. And I definitely could have approached this game better. Oh, wow, I forgot. Yeah, even a Forbidden Orchard triggers Leovold because its target opponent gets a spirit. We drew a force, but I can't cast this force, so it's useless. Another show and tell. Does a Bowmaster do anything? No, I'll just put the Underground Sea in. A new Atraxa. So this new Atraxa here is going to find them a force. And then once it has a force, yeah, I found them a force, and they can counter an Oko. And I can't counter back because I'm at 1 life. But this is a nice little example of how a game with Leovold could pan out. If the opponent had Forbidden Orchards and you had Leo, maybe this is another example of maybe a misplay. I wastelanded a Forbidden Orchard, but if I had wastelanded their Underground Sea instead and played a Leovold, anytime they made mana with their Orchard, I would have drawn a card. So this game is a pretty poor example of gameplay from my side, but I don't think that's a reason not for me to not upload it to you. Me making mistakes is just as, if not more, valuable to everybody else here. And we got to see a lot of really nice interactions in this game. That being said, let's try to win our follow-ups here. Force of Vigor and Assassin's Trophy are nice versatile answers to a couple things. Negation as well, and that's about it. So we have 3 cards we'd like to maybe bring in. Fatal Push has no targets, so we take that one out. Could theoretically take out some mana because our opponent's not attacking us with Wasteland. Lots of vintage decks are built to have extra mana sources because there's so many Wasteland spheres and stuff. Mental Misstep has very few good targets in the Oath matchup, but the ones it does have are very strong, like Ancestral and Thoughtseize. I'm more inclined to take out Collector Oof as it's just a little bit stinky against the Oath of Druid triggers if my opponent doesn't have a Forbidden Orchard. Okay, let's try like that. All right, need to keep a good 7 here that has good. Oh wow, that is a bug 7 if I've ever seen one. Okay, I like to keep. We have wow, that is crazy. All right, I have drawn in classic bug faction my on-color Moxen, so much to the point where I can play a turn 1 3-drop. I am interested in. I'm gonna play Leovold first this time. I think it has a little bit more leeway. Probably want blue-black land. A lot of blue mana cards in here. Yeah, let's go blue-black land. Black, blue, green, Leo. I could actually see some amount of argument for playing a Psychic Frog on turn 1 here. I would not be surprised if Psychic Frog had a lot of upside to the point where it's worth playing on turn 1. Remember that show and tell can't put Planeswalkers in play. So I would like to. I guess, yeah, there's no dazes. Don't want to. Okay, so they did have a force. I was almost hoping that they would force my Leovold. I do think the Oko is a bit more powerful in this matchup. Just being able to have a consistent answer to Atraxas is sometimes enough to battle through the triggers. We'll have to see if that comes to fruition here, though. Obviously, we lost out on the Oko this time. We do have a great answer to Oath of Druids in an uncounterable Abrupt Decay. I am going to just hit this Tropical Island, though, during their combat step. What is this? They have a 2-drop instant speed play? Did they have an Abrupt Decay? Wow. Okay. I didn't think they would have anything at instant speed, but we couldn't counter it anyways. We do get a card off it, though. Not a bad trade for us. I definitely think the green land is stronger than the blue-black land as well in terms of playing an Oath, though we have an Abrupt Decay. In classic bug fashion, I might turn off my Moxen here. It's just the most bug thing ever. I have blue, black, blue, green. So black and blue and frog. And then I'll turn off 2 of my lands to play a Collector Roof. The reason I want to play the Collector Roof, even though it hurts me more, is because I don't want my opponent to accelerate into a show and tell. What I really want is my opponent to play Oath of Druids, which I can interact with. See, my opponent had a Ruby here. They could play Show and Tell, and we would be at odds. I really would like to draw a blue card for Force off of this Frog. Any blue cards for Force? No. So this is a very important reason to keep up your blue count. If my opponent goes land Show and Tell here, it's not great for us, unfortunately. But if they don't have the mana because of the Collect Roof, then it all worked out pretty well. They did have the mana, but they did not have the Show and Tell. It's a little lucky. Surprised our opponent isn't attacking us with the Strip Mine, but maybe they don't have another mana and they are interested in being able to play Show and Tell as they're out here. We are really just looking for a blue card so that we have a Force. Of course, we've drawn the third of our fourth artifact mana. Just a very classic bug draw. The good news is I have a Frog, so that Lotus becomes a +1/+1 counter. Blue card, please. All right, a blue card. So definitely not going to play our Psychic Frog here. The only thing we really lose to is Show and Tell Atraxa, and we have a counter for it. Because Abrupt Decay would kill an Oath, and even then, an Oath would take too long, and they would die before they get to use their Oath. This was a good one. This was I mean, to be fair, we did draw one of our best possible hands by having 2 on-color Moxen and playing a Leovold and an Oko on turn 1 and 2. And we did have a Strip Mine to take them off of green mana. So really, this game went just according to plan, which is something that I definitely wanted to have in the video. So I'm happy. So far, this match is turning out to be a nice one. And might be the one you end up seeing. I guess you'll know already. But for these these new video series, this Vintage Vanguard, I'm trying to go a different way than the normal, you know, uncut 5-episode or 5-match league. I want to show one good match, and so maybe I have to play multiple matches to get to that spot. We'll have to see. This hand is dangerous. Wow. My opponent has not had explosive starts, but this one has some problems. I can't imagine you're supposed to... If I'm on the play, I would always keep this hand, but on the draw versus Oath, if they play a turn 1 Oath with an Orchard, it's a huge problem, but if they play a turn 1 Oath without an Orchard, we're okay. If they play a turn 1 Show and Tell, we're just dead. They mulled to 6. I'm going to try keeping this hand, but I think there's multiple reasons why you would put this hand back. The opponent's deck is a very volatile deck, a very all-in deck, and it's very important for us to have a counterspell on turn 1 of some kind, a force of some kind. We have 6 blue forces and a green force in our deck, but it's tough to pass up some of these cards here. Sensei's Top Strip Mine is an interesting start. So now the question is going to be, can I afford to play a Deathrite Shaman here? I think the answer is no. Yes? Huh. I'm like, so I'm not really worried about Oath, but I am very worried about Show and Tell. But if I get Show and Tell, I can follow up with an Oko, but the Oko is going to get forced if they get an Atraxa trigger, right? Ancestral doesn't necessarily draw me a force, though, and I have some blue cards. I don't know. I like the idea of playing a Deathrite Shaman here. By playing a Deathrite Shaman here, I have a really nice mana setup to follow up. Obviously, this exposes myself, but it also encourages them to play Oath. So if we can go, like, on the next turn, Abrupt Decay and Oath and a cast Ancestral, doesn't that put us in a great spot as well? They had to use their Strip Mine to spin their top is a great sign for us. Yeah, so it looks like a weaker 6-card hand from the opponent. Maybe they were looking for an extra land off the top. A Wasteland would be really nice here. Another Deathrite Shaman. So what I'm going to do is eat the card from my yard and get a Psychic Frog going. Make sure I make black mana here. This is a card that's going to quickly become an issue for our opponent and also lets me hold open the Ancestral Recall to try to draw into that force. Now, our opponent looked at their top 3 cards. They found a Probe. Gonna let them see the Ancestral without casting it. I kind of think they don't even have another land. They might spin again. Yeah. Now I'm gonna respond by casting Ancestral Recall. This way they can't like put a mental misstep on top or something like that. Found a force. Perfect. This game has gone pretty well. It was a little dicey, but opponent's hand was a little bit on the weaker side, and now we have access to a whole bunch of good stuff. They found a land drop here. They found an orchard. The only thing that can go even better is if we find a wasteland. Though resolving an Oko could be pretty good as well. Is this ancestral? I don't want to give up Oko to counter Ancestral, but I also don't want them to get back in this game. I'm going to force it. I'm going to force it and see how that goes. I drew another Oko. Perfect. Let's attack. I'm going to discard a Deathrite Shaman. I don't think I'm playing another Deathrite Shaman here. There's definitely some power in a Collector Oof and an Oko. Maybe playing both of them in the same turn would be very nice. Wasteland is my best draw. Spell Pierce is great, though. Spell Pierce is a phenomenal draw. Let's go Underground Sea, Emerald, and then I have 5 mana. So let's see if they have a force. If they have a force, they definitely have to look at countering this Oko, or else our board is going to be too strong. Yeah, they don't have one. GG's to our opponent. We were able to vanquish our Oath of Player here. I thought this was actually a really good one. The first game was really my fault in a keep. Not saying that I shouldn't keep that hand, but I at least should have considered mulliganing that hand, especially knowing my opponent is likely to be on Oath. But these games were a really nice showing of why and how you can play a nice little tempo plan, disrupting your opponent and getting underneath them. Even though we're a creature deck, which Oath is supposed to prey on, we have a lot of really strong tools in the matchup. I hope you enjoyed this Vintage Vanguard Bug Edition. I am expecting to put 10 more videos in this video series. All the decks that we talked about during the matchup section will get their own videos to help you understand the ins and outs of the most played decks in Vintage. New gameplay footage on my YouTube channel every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Subscribe, and I'll see you then.